Right, good evening, everybody. And thank you very much for giving up your evening this evening. As always, I've put everybody on mute so that we don't have any background noise. And if everyone can stay muted until it comes to questions. If you've got a question, then use the raise hand function or type it in the chat function, and we'll do all the questions at the end of this session. We have had a lot of interest in this session, but also a lot of people that had other things on. So as usual, we are recording it so that people can listen to it afterwards. So tonight we're thrilled to bring to you a very different type of webinar to the norm. Instead of a practical topic, I know Jack will bring a much wider viewpoint and a different slant to get your minds thinking a little bit differently. He will enlighten you on the bigger picture from his expert knowledge and research. I first heard Jack at a CL conference last year, and he really made me stop and think about what we're doing in the industry. So I'm hoping that will be the same for you guys. He's originally from Maryland in the United States, but currently at the University of Nottingham, where he's Director of Food Systems, where he's leading research and education on global food systems. He has many years of experience and is a recognised leader in his field. And if anybody likes reading, Jack has written a book, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. So there's a book for anybody that likes reading. Jack's mission is to create the future of food by harnessing science, policy, value and communication about the global food system. I know Jack will give you plenty of food for thought this evening, and do take time to type a question in the chat or jot it down and ask the question at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Jack. Please enlighten us on how agriculture might save the planet.
Great. So yeah, let me bring up my slides here. And just let me know if they're showing up for you.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. Great. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and to talk about this important point. I spent 13 years with the U.S. Department of State working on global food policy, and spent a few years covering Africa food policy, then Asia, then Europe. Then I gave up all my supervisory responsibilities in my last few years at the State Department. My only job was giving speeches. So I had a sort of an unlimited travel budget, could travel anywhere in the world and just talk about the future of food, the role of science, and how do we better communicate to the public. However, recently, in July of last year, I moved to the UK to launch a new Food Systems Institute at the University of Nottingham. So I'm really excited to be here. But I want to talk to you about a topic that I think a lot of people don't think about. Can agriculture save the planet? I think many of you probably feel a little bit like you're under attack in terms of agriculture, that agriculture is seen as destroying the planet instead of saving the planet. And so hopefully I'll give you a little bit of food for thought in terms of how consumers think about food and agriculture. How can we reduce some of that tension in our food system so that we can all work together to create a more sustainable, nutritious, equitable future for everybody. So when I begin, though, I want to talk a little bit about some of the impacts of agriculture, because in many ways, there's nothing we do that has a more negative impact than agriculture. But of course, there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So how do we maintain and grow those benefits and reduce the negatives? If we were to talk about land, 40% of all the land on Earth is already being used for agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there's just nothing more important than agriculture. I think most of us would agree that the footprint of agriculture is as big, if not bigger, than we'd like it to be. If we were to talk about water, this is the Colorado River in the United States, the 5th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. And that's largely because of agricultural withdrawals of water, 70% of all fresh water. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. That's almost as much as energy, and it's more than anything else. And so for many people, though, when they talk about agriculture, it's about those impacts. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture everywhere in the world, there are positive rates of return. So how do we shift that narrative for agriculture from a problem to be solved to a solution to the problem? Now, as much of the challenges we have today, we're going from 8 to 9.5, maybe 10 billion people by 2050. So the impacts of agriculture are only going to grow. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, we need about 25% more food by 2050 in order to meet the needs of that growing planet. So that's at least 25% more protein or even more. So again, tremendous challenge meeting that in a sustainable and nutritious way. About 800 people will go to bed hungry tonight. And that's completely unacceptable in a world like we have today, where we produce so much. And so, that's a problem. But we also have about 9 million people who die every year from hunger-related illnesses. And it's really hard for most people to wrap their minds around that. So that's 25,000 people will die today of hunger-related illnesses. That's 1,000 people over the next hour of this presentation and discussion will die of hunger. That's one person every 4 seconds, mostly children. How do we get people to appreciate that these are not statistics, but these are individuals? There's not a single person who wouldn't go out and help that child if they saw them. But if you don't see them, you think that these problems don't necessarily exist. And so how do we bring home to people how important this topic really is? Now, 800 million people, as I said, that's a tragedy. And it's one of the reasons that people often say our food system is broken. If we were together, I'd be asking you, raise your hand the last time, if you've heard this idea that our food system is broken, because I hear it a lot. And it begs the question, though, if our food system is broken, when was it not broken? Was it better 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? I don't think so. And so part of the problem is that people don't really understand where we came from to understand where we are so that we can prepare for where we're going. And so just to put that into perspective, 800 million people, unacceptable, 10% of all the people on the planet hungry. And yet, 30 years ago, 20% of all the people on the planet would have been going to bed hungry. 60 years ago, 30% of all the people on the planet would have been going to bed hungry. So as bad as it is, as unacceptable as it is, it's still wildly better than where we were. So understanding where we've come from is critically important to understanding what we need to do. If we were talking about childhood mortality, at the lowest point in all of human history, not just a little lower, but dramatically lower. So how do we get people to appreciate the distance that we've come? Another example relates to the resources necessary to produce, I'm going to use as an example, a bushel of corn in the United States. So between 1980 and 2011, how much better is the agricultural production? And it would be similar here in the UK and Europe and other places over that time. So to produce a bushel of corn in 2011, a farmer would emit 35% fewer greenhouse gases to produce that bushel. There would be 40% less land needed to produce it, 40% less energy, 50% less water, and 60% less erosion to produce that bushel of corn. Things are not just better, they're wildly better. Now, the fact that things are better doesn't mean they're perfect, because we also need more food. So there's still erosion, there's still eutrophication of waterways, there's still impacts from agricultural production. But it's not because we're doing worse and worse. It's because we're not doing better fast enough to keep up with that growing demand. And meeting that growing demand is the reason that hunger and nutrition have declined so much. And so it's not that things are bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. Things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. And that's really important to be able to communicate that. The narrative helps to determine whether or not people are looking at agriculture as the problem to be solved or agriculture as the solution to the problem. How do we reframe this conversation? Now, one of the things that I found is that there's sort of the difference in how the average consumer thinks about sustainability and how farmers and ranchers in the food industry itself think about sustainability. And I like to look at this in terms of what I call local sustainability versus global sustainability. Local sustainability is how consumers think about it. They're thinking if you use less water, less fertilizer, less insecticide, less inputs to produce your crop or to produce your livestock, then you're more sustainable. And to a certain extent, that's true. It has a lighter impact on that piece of land if you use fewer inputs. But of course, there's a reason you use inputs, and that's in order to increase productivity. So the point is that with local productivity, the benefits are local, less of an impact, but the impacts are global because somebody else has to make up the difference. Global sustainability is just the opposite. The more intensively we farm, the more impact we have on that piece of land, but the fewer pieces of land we need someplace else. So the impacts are local, but the benefits are global and spread out and hard to see. So it's not as if one is good or bad or right or wrong. It's just about trade-offs. It's a continuum from local sustainability to global sustainability, and there will always be trade-offs between the two. The question isn't should we have one or the other. The question is where should we have a lighter footprint and where can we afford to be a little more intensive in our farming system? It's all about trade-offs. And so an example of how that's playing out, though, in policy, if we were to look at Europe's farm to fork strategy, I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. And some of the things it calls for is a 50% reduction in the pesticide risk, 20% reduction in fertilizer, and moving to 25% of all the land in Europe being under organic systems. So that's a choice. But the consequence of that choice, according to the European Commission, is that Europe will produce 15% less food. So that's a lot. So a consequence of this lighter footprint, this local sustainability approach in Europe, is that they're exporting their impact to the rest of the world, who has to step up to meet their food needs. Now, the country that sends the most food to Europe most of the time is Brazil. So think about that. Europe is exporting its agricultural footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea. And so we need to think about not just what's happening on a farm or in a country, but also its impact globally. And those are conversations that aren't happening to the extent that they really need to be. Because under Europe's approach, if they produced no food in Europe, there would be no environmental footprint for food production. Obviously, that's not true. So how do we have a more reasonable and rational conversation so that consumers understand those trade-offs so they can make better decisions? Now, another example of what productivity has done is this green bar. The amount of cereals production has dramatically increased. And of course, that's the reason that we've reduced the footprint of the number of people that are hungry, whereas the land use is relatively flat for the last 70 years or 60 years. And so one of the things that we don't think about is what would the world look like if we hadn't improved agricultural productivity, if we were producing food the way we did in 1960? Well, there are about 3.6 billion hectares of forest on the planet. And if we were producing food the way we did in 1960, we would need 1 billion additional hectares of land in order to produce that food. So it's easy to see when somebody cuts down a forest and replaces it with a field of soybeans or with livestock production, you can blame agriculture for that. But that billion hectares of forest that only exist because of improvements in agriculture, well, we don't give agriculture credit for that. And so how do we help people to understand that? Agriculture can be both the biggest driver of deforestation and the biggest protector of forests. Those two things can be true at the same time. And so if you don't understand that, you push for less intensive agriculture, which ironically leads to even more deforestation. How do we have a more nuanced conversation about these topics? And I think in many ways, farmers have been on this journey for 100 years. We had we had fertilizer and then seed technology and mechanization, and all of these things have led to dramatic improvements, which we saw in that last chart. So how do we get people to recognize what's already happened and what more needs to happen. And for me, farmers often don't think in terms of sustainability because they're thinking in terms of economics and productivity. But that innovation, which equals efficiency for the farmer, is really just another way of saying sustainability. So often we're just using different terms for the same thing, but because of that lack of understanding of the terms we use, we often end up in disagreements where there shouldn't be. Now, before I joined the university, I was with the Nature Conservancy. Most of you probably haven't heard of it, but the Nature Conservancy is the world's largest conservation organization, more than $1 billion a year in programming, operating in 76 countries around the world. And I was director of global food and water policy for them. And one of the things that I found with many conservation organizations is they're very good at telling farmers what they should do. And I don't know anybody who likes to be told what to do. I've got 2 kids. If I tell them what they should do, I can be pretty sure they're going to do exactly the opposite. So how do we talk about things in a different way? How do we talk about what you could do? Because I know that most of us want to do better, and could is an opportunity. And so instead of blaming farmers for not doing more, the real question is, what more can we do to help farmers get to their 2070 goals by 2050? How can we accelerate that pace of change? Because remember, things are not bad and getting worse, they're good and getting better, but not fast enough. How do we help you to move faster by giving you the support and the resources you need? Because you're already on this journey. You're doing better every single year. We've got decades of research to prove that. And so how do we help you to get to that sustainable future more quickly? And people often ask, what does sustainable agriculture look like? And of course, there's no such thing as sustainable agriculture, because agriculture 30 years from now will be wildly more sustainable than it is today. But 30 years after that, it will be even better. Agriculture today is wildly more sustainable than it was in the past, which is why I say sustainability is a journey. It's not a destination. All of you are on that journey. How do we bring together all of these people that are working towards that journey so that we can move faster? How do we bring people together to solve problems instead of talking about things in a way that actually makes it more difficult to achieve a common goal? Because we often have these competing views of what the future of food should look like. On one hand, there's a slow food movement that says we should be producing food the way it was produced 100 years ago. And of course, we have this high-tech intensive view of agriculture that says we need to be moving faster, faster, faster. And many people think that these 2 trends are moving in opposite directions, but I think they're just 2 ends of the same spectrum. It's about local sustainability and it's about global sustainability. And we need to improve both ends and maybe make them look a little bit more like each other. And so how do we bring these 2 threads, these 2 trends together so that we can accelerate the pace of improvement? Because many people think innovation is the problem. On one hand, people love innovation when it comes to their latest smartphone and gadget and TV and other things. On the other hand, people detest change. So people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And it really depends on how you frame it. If it's something people want, like the smartphone, then it's totally fine. If it's something like how they produce food, whether that's gene editing or GM crops or AI or other things, then people might be suspicious. So how do we use language that gets people excited about the opportunities in agriculture instead of putting up barriers? And this is important because in many ways, consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. So because they care so passionately, they're asking for you to produce food in a certain way. But because they don't really understand agricultural production anymore, because we're all so far removed from it, or at least most of us, the things they ask for may not deliver the kinds of change they actually want. So how do we help them to understand production so that things they ask you to do are the things that actually deliver what they want, and then maybe they're willing to pay for it? Because science tells us what we can do, but ultimately it's the public that tells us what we should do. And so it doesn't matter if we have amazing technologies and innovations and other things if we never get to use them. And so how do we create that space that allows innovations to come to market? So one of the things I want to talk about now is really consumer psychology. How do we talk about these things? How do people think about these issues? So I want to give you guys a little visual experiment here. So I want you to look at this and think about which of these squares do you think looks darker? So you don't have to put it in the chat or anything, but just think about the answer. Do you think A is darker or do you think B is darker? And if you're suspicious and not trusting, that's probably a good idea. Because if we bring that rectangle down and you cover up the two spaces, what you see is that A and B are actually exactly the same gray. I'll do it again just to convince you. And what's happening here is a visual illusion. Our brain sees A is surrounded by white space, so it thinks it's darker. And it sees B is surrounded by darker spaces, so it thinks it's lighter. And so it's actually sort of color correcting or shade correcting for us because it thinks that B is in shade and shadow. And so what's happening here is our brain is actually leading us astray. So if you leave this presentation remembering one thing, it's don't trust your brain because it often leads us astray. And I show this because it's important for us to recognize that sometimes things we know with absolute certainty are true aren't true. And we have to be willing to sort of open our mind to change, to see the world in a different place. Knowing something is true and being able to see it as true aren't necessarily the same thing. Another cognitive bias that we talk about in psychology is something called confirmation bias. Now, I'm sure that you're all very familiar with the idea of confirmation bias, the idea that we look for information that supports our ideas and we discount information that doesn't support our ideas. Now, we're all really, really good at identifying bias in other people. We can see it in our spouses and our children and our friends and the government and anybody, but it's hard to see it in ourselves. So I like to give an example of my own bias. So if I were to read an article that said organic production is more nutritious than conventional agricultural production, what would I do? I'd ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? Now, those are pretty reasonable things to do, right? It's how did they do it? Who are the people? Where did they get their money? The problem is that, what would happen if the article said organic production no more nutritious than conventional agriculture? What would I do? I'd tweet it or I'd exit. I'm not sure what we say anymore. So the point is that would be an example of my bias. In the first case, I'm just being, conscientious. I'm following the science by asking those tough questions. But you don't ask tough questions of the things that are consistent with your beliefs. And so if we don't take the time to understand our own biases, it's actually very hard to have a conversation with somebody else about theirs. And it's almost impossible to actually convince them of anything because we don't have that insight into, our own areas of, where we don't understand things ourselves. So another of these cognitive biases is something called the availability heuristic. Now, it's just a complicated way of saying what things come to mind when I say a word. So when I say the word natural, most of us are thinking butterflies and rainbows and puppies, and our minds go to a really happy place. But what about Ebola, E. coli, Zika, Salmonella? Those things are all natural too, right? All the bad things in the world are also natural. And so it doesn't matter though. Most people think happy thoughts when they hear the word natural. And so again, understanding how our minds sometimes lead us to the wrong place is helpful because then we can begin to understand how to use language in a way that helps to convey the mood and the feeling that we're trying to and avoid being distracted by language. So another example of this, sometimes people will say, if you can't pronounce the ingredients in a food, you shouldn't eat it. And, that might sound reasonable to many people. If a fifth grader can't pronounce it, you shouldn't eat it. The scientist in me, just wants to scream, just because you can't pronounce a word doesn't make it good or bad. And so I sort of want to beat people up with science in order to prove that they're wrong, that idea makes no sense. But instead of doing that, what you could also do is just show them that all food is made of chemicals. And the chemicals that food is made of, most of us can't pronounce. And so what happens is you show people a graph like this or a chart, and a lot of people just laugh because they get the point you're trying to make. And the point I'm trying to make is that instead of beating people up with science, we need to lead them to knowledge. People like to learn things. They don't like to be told things. How do we make conveying the information about operations and agriculture and all this interesting so people are interested in acquiring that information instead of feeling like we're trying to force something on them that makes them feel suspicious, in fact, of what we're trying to say? How do we change the nature of those conversations? So now I want to talk a little bit about trends. And often we misunderstand what trends mean. And I want to give you an example. This example relates to transparency. I think most of us recognize that consumers are demanding more and more transparency in the food system. They want to know, where did their food come from? They want to know the provenance of that food. And so they're asking for more information. And so I often ask people, well, what do you think consumers will be demanding 20 years from now? Do you think consumers will, or do you think transparency will be even more important 20 years from now for the consumer than it is today? Do you think transparency will be about as important as it is today? Or do you think it won't be important at all? Now, most people will say it's going to be at least as important and probably more important to the consumer. And my answer is, I don't think it'll be important at all. And the reason I say that is transparency today is a little bit like food safety was 100 years ago. Consumers really cared about food safety 100 years ago because food could kill you. And in many ways, brands arose as a promise not to kill the consumer. Now, eventually they became a sign of quality, but originally it's just, buy our canned beans, they won't kill you. And so over time, it went from being a ceiling, something that companies aspired to, safety, to a floor that consumers expected. And they're not going to pay more for food safety in a way that they would have originally. And so what the point I'm making is that transparency will continue to become more important, and it'll be part of your operations in the food system and other things, but consumers aren't going to keep caring about it. A point will arrive where they just assume that transparency should be there. And so often when I'm talking to organizations, they'll ask, do we need to be more transparent in our ingredients or other things? And my response is, you can either be more transparent today, and maybe the market will reward you, or you can wait 5 or 6 years until there's a failure and something comes up that you didn't disclose, and you're going to be punished by the market. And then you're going to become more transparent. And so you're going to do it either way. The question is, do you want to be rewarded by the market, or do you want to have been punished by the market first? And so we understand where the trends are going, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing that we expect them to mean. And I think the same thing is true of sustainability, that we can expect that more and more requirements, either from the consumer or from policy or regulation, will continue to push us in a direction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the consumer is going to see it in that way. And that's one of the reasons that I say that when we're thinking about sustainability, sometimes people will ask, well, will the consumer pay for sustainability? So it's like, I'm going to go to all this effort. Is somebody going to pay me for it? And the problem is that consumers won't change what they eat to save their lives. So why do we think they'll change what they eat to save the planet? Now, for some, they read that and they think, okay, well, why would I do sustainability? Maybe it's just not necessary. But the fact that consumers want it, and even though they won't pay for it, well, it still means that food companies and large corporations are going to expect it. It still means that governments are going to require it. It's still a trend, even if consumers aren't willing to pay for it, because it's where the future is going, because we've been on this journey for 100 years. I mean, we know that sustainability improves year after year. We've talked about it in terms of efficiency. Now we're talking about it in terms of sustainability, but we know where it's going. And so, again, understanding trends and understanding how consumers think about them and understanding how businesses think about them helps us to be able to communicate about it better so that we understand what we need to do as well. And so in that respect, I want to talk a little bit about sort of how to think about the future. Now, for most of us, I would say when we think about the future, we're sort of asking the question, what do I think will happen? And what should I do to prepare for it? And so you're probably doing that all the time on your farm, your operation. You know, what do I think is going to happen? And for me, this is sort of like strategic planning. Strategic planning is about thinking about what do I think is most likely to happen and how do I prepare for the place I think the world is going. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have to do strategic planning. It allows you to anticipate, you know, what's happening in the economy and prepare for it. But strategic planning can only prepare you for the future you expect. So you're not going to get any place new. And so I spent a lot of time sort of working as a food futurist. And in that way, what we talk about is not, you know, the future we all expect. That's the probable future. And that's what strategic planning is all about. But the world might not end up in that probable future. There's also this possible future that's maybe not quite as likely, but it could happen. And then there's this plausible future that's pretty unlikely, but still possible. And so the reason that's interesting is because if I were to ask you, what is your preferred future? Like, what's the best future for you? My guess is it's not that probable future. It's probably in that possible future category. Maybe it's out there in that plausible future category. So it's someplace different. And this is important because instead of preparing for the future you expect, we need to do something different. So what we really need to do is we need to think about that future time and then think about, well, what should I do next based on the place I want to go, not the place I expect to go. That's strategic planning. And when we do, we get to a different place. So it's really about not preparing for the future you expect, but creating the future that you want. And I'll get there. But I want to give you an example of what that might look like. So a lot of you may be hearing about the protein transition. There's a lot of pressure. You know, people are saying that we need to eat less meat or produce meat in a different way, that we need to eat more plant-based. All of these things create a lot of pressure for your industry and for and so you may feel under attack on this protein transition. And so that's one of the reasons why we see in places like Italy, they're calling for a ban, or they've called for a ban on cultivated meat, lab-grown meat. Places like Austria and France are following suit. So there's this pressure to ban some of these alternative proteins. And so I think that people feel like they're trying to put me out of business. So why shouldn't I try to put them out of business? You know, it makes a lot of sense to stifle the competition. So I want to do, and we hear about this from others. You know, Bill Gates said a few years ago that in 2030, we will all be eating synthetic meat. Now, I don't know anybody who wants to be eating synthetic meat in 2030. And so the reality is that, like, when he talks about that, he actually makes that future less likely because it's not a very appetizing future. But the point is that when somebody tells you they're trying to put you out of business, most of us take action. You know, I don't want to go out of business. I don't want my operation to go out of business. I don't want to shut down my farm. And so how these alternative protein companies are talking about it, how many governments are talking about it, you know, I think it makes farmers and ranchers nervous. I think they feel on the defensive, and I think that they want to take action. And we see that action happening on the streets of Paris and France right now. So I want to ask you right now, and I actually want to do this as a poll, that what protein future do you think is best for you? And so there are 3 different scenarios, and then we'll put this up on the screen in just a moment. So in scenario 1 is the one where I say livestock wins. So in this scenario, we need 25% more protein by 2050, and we get there by expanding animal agriculture by 25%. So demand increases, supply increases, 25% more. Scenario 2, alternative proteins win. 100% of that growth of 25% in protein production is met through alternative proteins. Now, that could be that we're eating more lentils and chickpeas. It could be that we're eating more plant-based products. It could be that we're eating cultivated lab-grown meat. So it could be any of those things. But what it doesn't mean, is that we're not eating more animal protein in scenario 2. And then in scenario 3, it's sort of what I call livestock goes bust. We're actually producing 10 or 20% less animal protein in 2050. So my question for you, and I'll let Katie run the poll now, is which of these futures is best for you? 1, 2, or 3? Do you want to take it, Katie?
Yep, it should be live now. So if you can't see it in the middle of your screen, have a look in the chat and hopefully it's there for you.
Okay, so I'll give you a minute or so, and maybe just tell me when you think enough people have responded that we can go ahead and sort of put up the results.
We'll give them
or I can say them. Okay, so yeah, so which future, and nobody's keeping track. Put out there whatever you think, and then when we get to the Q&A, we can have a conversation about it. But I'm really curious about which of these scenarios you think is best for you.
I'll leave it there in the chat, and then we can come back to it in the questions.
Okay, so you can't change your answer. So here's what I want you to think about, though. In scenario 1, where livestock wins, that means we've added 2 billion animals to the planet to produce that protein. It would require cutting down about 10 or 20% of our forests in order to produce the crops and the livestock production. So a 10 or 20% expansion of livestock and crop production. And for you here in Europe, there's probably not going to be an expansion of agriculture, of livestock production. All of that expansion is going to be happening mostly in Brazil and Argentina, so in South America. So for most of you, there's an increase in demand and there's an increase in supply, and your incomes will be flat. So your incomes are flat, but there's huge deforestation as a cause of it, as a consequence, and there's even more pressure on you to shut down your operations. And so, people don't love the products. And so, you're in a situation where people are even more concerned about animal agriculture, and you're not making more money. In scenario 2, where alternative proteins expand to meet that demand, well, if demand for animal agriculture increases by 25%, but supply is flat, you're almost certainly making more money. And we're not going to have that deforestation, and people are going to view you as an ultra premium product, and they're going to love you. That's the world in which you actually make more money than in scenario 1. And scenario 3, well, let's imagine that there's a 10 or 20% reduction in livestock production in 2050. Well, if that reduction occurs in the least productive countries on the planet, places like India and Brazil, well, now demand for your product is going through the roof because, again, we have a 35-40% demand for protein, and it's not going to be met through traditional livestock, making 4 or 5 times more money. So the scenario in which you make the most money is actually the one where we reduce livestock production in the least productive places. Now, that's not necessarily the world that we're heading towards, because of course, the most pressure is in places like Europe to reduce livestock production. So in many ways, we're doing the worst of all worlds. We're going to be reducing livestock production in the most productive places, which puts the most pressure on the planet. And so we need to be thinking about this so that we can communicate it, so that we can change how we talk about it. So one of the thoughts I want to leave you with is that we need to stop preparing for the future that we expect, and we need to start creating the future that we want. We often are, fighting groups and others that we don't really need to be, but because of the language they're using, we're responding to it. So how do we bring people together to solve problems instead of further dividing us? So as I draw to a conclusion here, I want to help you to understand why this specific moment in time matters so much. Now, we've already said we're going from 8 to 9.5 billion people on the planet by 2050. And really, that's the point where most people stop talking about the future. We all stop at 2050. We got to get to 2050, population growth to 2050. Well, what happens to population after 2050? Well, what happens is it slows dramatically. And so what people don't realize is that we've already reached peak child. The number of children born next year will be less than this year, and they'll be less the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. We have already reached peak child. We're going down every year for the rest of human history. There will be fewer children born year after year. So you might wonder, how can population growth continue if we're not having more kids? And the answer is people are living longer. 100% of that growth is because of people living longer, but they will not live forever. And so the challenge that we have in terms of sustainability in the future is not to produce more and more and more future forever, and things just get worse and worse and worse. The challenge we have is to get to 2050 without cutting down our forest and draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Because if we do, in many ways, we are good forever. Because if productivity goes to 2050 and we haven't screwed things up, and then it continues after that, we've got this huge opportunity. All of the improvements after 2050 go to reducing the footprint of agriculture. So the thought is that every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. But every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world if we haven't screwed things up. So the thought I want to leave you with is the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the 10,000-year history of agriculture, and they are. They're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right. And that's why we need for governments and the consumer and others to join us in order to accelerate the improvement that we're already going to make so that we can get to our 2070 goals by 2030 or 2050 so that agriculture can, in fact, save the planet. So just to recap quickly, the points I'm making is that we need people to understand that things are getting better, but not fast enough, that there aren't any perfect solutions, only trade-offs, that how we communicate matters, that sustainability is a journey, not a destination, and that the next 30 years will determine the fate of the planet. If we can help the public and governments to understand that, then it will create this opportunity for us to do a better job and get the resources that you need, that we all need, in order to deliver that sustainable, nutritious, and equitable future. So I appreciate everything that you're doing. And at the university, we look forward to working with you and partners like ABP and others in order to deliver that future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. So that you know the answers to your poll, what protein is best for you in the future? 48% said livestock wins, 30% alternative protein, and 22% said livestock goes bust.
So, I mean, maybe we should just run the poll again and see if anybody changed their mind, or maybe that's just going to be too demoralizing for me. And so I don't know, maybe I shouldn't ask that question. But why don't we go ahead and start, see if there are any questions here. I do appreciate everybody sticking around.
And there's no such thing as a silly question. So if you're thinking it, please do ask it, because other people probably are too. Harry, do you want to unmute yourself? I know you had a question really early on, so far away.
Yeah, at the British Cattle Conference a couple of weeks ago, can't remember the speaker, but he said that there's 30% food waste in the world, or in UK definitely, and overeating in the world as well. If you sort those two issues out, there'd be enough food to feed 10 million people. I don't know, was that true or not, or what?
Well, in theory, it's probably true, but food waste is not one problem. It's different whether it's an apple, a potato, or bread. So those are the three most wasted food items here in the UK. And so how they get lost, in the food supply is different. In the developing world, that waste generally comes pre-consumer. In countries like the UK, it's mostly post-consumer. And so how are we going to get rid of the 40% waste that's happening post-consumer when consumers are already struggling to have the money they need to pay for their food? So they're not throwing away food because they don't care about the value of it. Something else is going on. And so it's going to be really hard to get to the post-consumer food waste. The waste in the food supply, everybody in the food supply has an interest in not having it. So, farmers don't want to waste food in the field, and transporters don't want to, and processors don't want to. So it's not that it is true that if we could squeeze that out of the system, the problem is it's really hard or it wouldn't exist. And so we should absolutely be working on it. There are new ideas, for doing that. And so what was the second part of the equation? Oh, the obesity and overconsumption. So I think in many ways, that's a much more interesting opportunity. So, in the US, some of you may be aware of some of these new drugs, weight loss drugs that are coming out, GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic. And, so I'm actually working on a research paper on that same question. What would happen if 50% of Americans were taking these drugs? Well, that could lead to a 10 to 20% reduction in calories. So that really could deliver some of that change that you're talking about. But, remember that we have 800 million people who don't have enough food today. And the very first thing that people ask for when, incomes increase is more animal protein. And so, a lot of those calories are carbs, they're not animal protein. And so it will be complicated to get that to the right people at the right time. I mean, if people that were in, that are not getting the calories they need had more money, you would produce the food to get it to them. So in many ways, it's not really a lack of production problem. It's a lack of demand where people can afford it. And so how you solve those problems is different. So it's complicated, but in every scenario, if you improve your productivity and sustainability, it still either improves your bottom line or it makes things better. So there's no scenario where sustainability, turns out to be a wasted investment. You're going to either save money or you're going to produce the same amount more efficiently. But it's a really good question. I mean, it's a very fair question.
Has anybody else got a question? There must be some more questions out there. Do you want to just pop your hand up and I'll... Rachel, if you just make sure you unmute yourself.
There we go. There we are. Hi. I'd like to ask Jack what his views are on the debate, particularly sort of relevant to the UK, really, on land sparing versus land sharing. That's something we're reading about all the time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a really important question. And, I think the diversity of the food system is part of its strength. And so there are places where, frankly, it would make sense to, allow it to be, to rewild. But, intensive, there will always be a place for more intensive systems. And there are definitely pieces of land where we should have a lighter footprint. And so each country is sort of going to draw the line in a different place. But there are places where, sharing makes more sense. And the best farmland that can be intensively farmed, that might not be the right place to do land sharing. And so we need to sort of recognize that, we need intensive agriculture in some places, and we need, more of an agroecological approach in others. This morning, I was looking at some data showing sort of the productivity of a farm. And one of the things that became very clear is that certain pieces of land on sort of like the western margin of that land were losing money. And so if they were planting that strip, they're losing money for that, 5% of their field. So they could absolutely turn that into a hedgerow, or they could plant, some sort of a cover crop, or they could plant, sanctuary for pollinators, and they would make money because they wouldn't be wasting it. And so, I like to say big data reveals small differences. And so I think that more data is going to help people to make better, wiser decisions. So I think it's going to be, a bit of all of the above. And if people try to force them down one path or another, I think it's often just not going to work. because you know your land better than anybody else. And so telling you whether it should be intensive or in a different system, you know, is probably not the right way to go. But we do need more of that diversity.
Thank you.
Harry, did you have another question?
Well, it's more of a comment. The poll you put up, we're sort of seeing that now in terms of beef and lamb prices are record level, and they look to be still going up slowly. Is that down to less supply? Like your third option in the poll suggested that.
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit. I didn't catch the full question.
Oh, with beef and lamb prices now, they're at an all-time high, and they seem to be creeping up as well, still going up.
Yeah.
It sort of suggests that your third option in the poll is coming true now, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, I went back and I looked at some of the data in the United States. And so what I saw was that the amount of the number of head of cattle produced in the United States is about 5% below where it was in 1970. And so we've reduced our herd size in the US. We're producing about 25% more beef than we did in 1970, though, and that's because, you know, it's more productive. But one of the things I found is that if you look at just like the last 20 years, what you see is that beef production in the US is basically flat, but the value of that beef is twice what it was in 2000. So we're not producing more, but, you know, it's twice as valuable. So that sort of goes to that point that I'm making, is that, you know, people are switching to more poultry. They're not eating as much. You know, population has expanded, but demand has not kept up with it. But it's not that they're going broke because people, you know, are increasing. They're just paying more for what they eat. So the average American eats less beef, but pays exactly the same as they did in 2000, sort of constant dollars.
Okay, thank you. We've got one in the chat from Sean. How do I, as a livestock farmer, actually do anything to get politicians or members of the public on board?
Yeah, one thing that I'm surprised I don't hear more calls for things called carbon border adjustments. In other words, food that's brought into the UK, we should be looking at the carbon footprint of that. And if we did, then all of a sudden, you know, you could then decide, you know, is it make more sense just from a sort of a emissions perspective to be importing it versus producing it. And, you know, in Europe, they have this carbon border adjustment mechanism that's going to be coming into force, but they exclude agriculture. And so I think part of it is just, you know, helping governments to make sure that they're doing that carbon accounting for the stuff that's coming in the same way that they're asking you to do it. And I think that it's good that they're asking you to, you know, be able to provide metrics for how sustainable you are, because I think over time you will definitely get better, and, you know, and that you will beat the competition globally. And so I see that as an opportunity. And then the government will sort of have that tough choice. It's like, well, we're importing all of this unsustainable stuff. Maybe we should be investing more in producing it here in the UK, or we should recognize that, you know, it's just a trade-off. And, you know, many of the policies would drive reductions of production in the UK and in Europe. And so I think we need governments to understand those trade-offs better. And I don't think there's been that much of a conversation about that. And so I think that, you know, one, you can advocate for that, whether it's with the National Farmers Union or government, universities partnering with us in order to publish more on this topic. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm here for. I mean, that's why I think that the UK is an important place. So I think there might have been another question though.
Sorry, I can't remember your name. James's wife.
Yeah, it's Liz. That's right.
Sorry, Liz.
Jack, I just wanted to ask you what you felt. There's so much, especially in Wales, about people having to put 20% of their farm into trees. why is it not being recognised that grass is such a good carbon sink as well? And actually, you can establish grass much quicker than you can establish a tree. So surely that should be taken into account with these bodies that talk about sustainability and carbon sinks. It's not all about trees, it's also about hedges and grassland. I wanted to ask what you thought.
Yeah, I think, and I think the answer is that, many regions and countries are really focused on local sustainability. Like their metric is emissions per unit land. And, when you look at trees versus grass, you think, okay, well, it's going to have a lower footprint. But if you're not changing people's diets, then it's actually just shifting that burden to some other place. And that's really why we need to make sure that it's looking at all of the imported food as well. And, I don't know whether that's the right answer or the wrong answer for Wales, but I do suspect that Europe or the UK is a pretty productive place, and it's much more productive than many of the places, where you'd be exporting your footprint to. And so often though, it's about, we need intensive agriculture, or we need this lighter, and nobody's really looking at the trade-offs. Like, it's not about good and bad and right and wrong. We just need to talk about it in terms of choices and consequences. Yes, we can put these in trees, but as a consequence, we're going to increase the emissions of food consumption in Wales. Is that really what the government's trying to do? And then that would sort of force a different conversation than, this doesn't make any sense. And bringing in academics, such as myself and others, maybe into some of those conversations, might be helpful as well. So anybody should feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any assistance.
Thanks, Jack. Another question here, if the box of course, from Paul. Carbon calculators used at present do not represent ruminant livestock in a fair manner. We're not going to get onto a debate of, because there's obviously lots of different calculators, and they're all slightly different in different works. But have you got any comments on the carbon calculators, Jack?
I know there are certainly different ways of looking at it, but one of the biggest footprints for ruminants is really the indirect land use change component of it. And I think that European producers are sort of getting stuck with the same numbers that count for producers in places like Brazil, that the deforestation is actually happening. I mean, Europe in general is increasing its forest cover, not decreasing it. And so, we need to have a more regionally focused metric for looking at those emissions.
I think the other comment on that, Paul, is when you've done a carbon footprint, whatever company you use, try and stick with the same one. So you've actually got something to compare year on year. If you keep jumping around different calculators, you'll probably get a different figure. So once you've got a baseline from one calculator, continue to use that one would be my advice anyway. Has anybody else got any other questions? Liz, is that another question, or is your hand still up?
Sorry, no.
What's your view, Jack, on carbon sequestration? Because not all calculators at the moment do include sequestration. So what are your thoughts on sequestration and how that should be used?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly going to be difficult from a calculator perspective, just because it's it's hard to come up with a standard, across different types of production systems and lands and things like that. So I don't think we're quite there yet. But I do think that government and policy should still be encouraging things like cover crops and things that might enhance, reduction in tillage and other things that might enhance soil quality, even in the absence of data on sequestration. Because, low till or no till might have value, even if it doesn't lead to sequestration. It might improve the soil health, or water or other things, retention. So we're not going to get one metric that solves all problems. And so I think it's totally fine. I often hear here in the Nottingham area, people talk about, local food production is more sustainable. And the reality is sometimes it's not. But local food production has lots of things that are good about it, separate from the question of its exact emissions. We're supporting the local economy. You might have fresher food. People learn about the food production. So there are lots of reasons why we should be supporting local agriculture that may or may not, extend to sustainability. So you don't need one metric to solve everything.
Thank you. We've had another question from David. Is carbon footprint of food just another trend that we won't be spoken about in years to come, similar to transparency? If so, are we just causing a problem for future farmers?
So, transparency will be important. It just won't be important to the consumer. So it will still be expected of all of the food in the supply chain. And, transparency, does a lot of things. In order to have transparency, you need to understand your supply chain. And so things like blockchain and others help you to understand your supply chain. And the return on that investment might be food safety for many food manufacturers. The more they know about their supply chain, the safer that food can be. And that has an economic benefit. But once you understand your supply chain, then you have a better understanding of quality. And if you have a better understanding of quality, you might be able to talk about provenance. And so you might end up getting a premium. And so so transparency can deliver other benefits. I'm confident that carbon footprints, they may take different forms 10 years from now, but I'm confident that we will be trying to understand the footprint of different places. And I don't see it as a risk for UK farmers to be thinking about footprints, because I think they will do pretty well. I think the problem is that all of those places that are exporting to Europe don't have the data. And so, what really should be happening is that if you're going to have expectations pushed on you, that those expectations of having that data available should be, required or asked for those that want to export to the UK, to create a level playing field. And I think that'll work to your benefit.
Oh, we've just had another question. If anyone else has got any questions, either pop your hand up or type it in the chat. So Sean's asked another question. Is it true that agriculture is required to report on band 3 carbon emissions, whereas industries such as the aviation only have to report on bands 1 and 2? If so, is this not unfair representation of agriculture compared to the big industry?
I actually don't know the answer to that. Sorry. Would have to look into it.
Okay, thank you. I'll let Jack look into that, and obviously if he lets me know an answer, then I will let you know. But obviously there are differences, and if every industry was the same, it would make things simple, wouldn't it? Which none of us like simple. But thank you, Jack. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. I'll remember never to trust my brain.
Is there any chance we could run that poll again for the people that are left? I would just love to see if anybody has changed their minds, and it's okay if you don't. I'll be a little sad, but that's okay.
I think people can just go back in and change or add their comment. I can't change it to launch again, I don't think.
Okay.
So we are getting a few more responses or changes of responses on there. Livestock's definitely not winning as much now.
And it's okay to think I'm crazy. I've got a wife and kids, so plenty of people what I have to say. Well, and I do appreciate that, people are sort of, giving it some thought. One of the things I'd like to do at the university is figure out, can we have a future protein project where we actually bring people together to try to decide on what should the future of protein look like? And, because I want to think about the future. What's the future where you're wildly successful? What does that look like? And, can we bring different groups together to agree on that? So thank you.
It looks like Harry's bringing that, because he's you said about creating the future that you want it to be, and Harry said whatever the scenario, he'll be making more money. So I like your positivity, Harry, that you know what you want to do and you know your actions and you're going to drive to make yourself more successful. That's great news. I think we've all learned not to trust our brains. Thank you for enlightening us on how to create a more sustainable and nutritious future for everybody. Everyone now needs to just have a think about what you want the future to be and set those actions targets to what you want it to be, not what other people are telling it could be. So if you do one thing tonight, please just have a think about what you want the future to be, and drive to make it a success. So thank you very much, Jack, and thank you everybody for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and we'll see you again, hopefully some of you next week on fodder beet production. So let me know if you want to join that one, or click the link, because that's a joint one with AHDB. Thanks, guys. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.